You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleiman.
On today's episode, we welcome back Avishai Green, Israeli political scientist, to talk about the recent wave of protest in Israel against judicial reforms. To hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity, to read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. You can also make a donation to the podcast there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by MHI, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of MHI. In just a moment, we'll be talking to Avishai Green about protests in Israel. But first, as we do in every episode, Andrew and I will take a few minutes to talk about some current events. Hey, are you interested in taking part in a discussion with the Marxist-Humanist Initiative? If so, you should know that we occasionally have Skype meetings where we invite outsiders to take part in the meeting. Meetings take place on some Sundays between 1 and 3 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The next one is this Sunday, May 14th, and we'll be discussing new workers' struggles in Canada. If you want to be invited, you need to write to us immediately, telling us a little bit about why you're interested in MHI and asking to attend, and also send your Skype name or address. The meeting after that will be Sunday, May 28th, and that'll be about Ireland on the 25th anniversary of the peace accords, and also the ongoing crisis in England, and you need to apply for an invitation. You will want to write to MHI at Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org, and that's Marxist-Humanist Initiative, all one word. Yesterday, on May 9th, Donald Trump was found liable for sexual assault and defamation in a civil case brought against him in New York by E. Jean Carroll in relation to a sexual assault which took place in the 90s. The jury awarded E. Jean Carroll $5 million in this civil case. Now, this is a civil case, not a criminal case, because the statute of limitations has long since passed for this assault. But one of the interesting things about this story is that because of a new law that was just passed last year in New York State called the Adult Survivors Act, victims of sexual assault are given a 1-year window to try to hold their attackers liable in civil courts. They can basically sue them for sexual assault. The day this law was passed in New York last year, E. Jean Carroll filed this suit against Trump. And now, after an extremely short deliberation, how long did the jury deliberate?
Less than 3 hours. It was unbelievable. It was like a New York minute, you know?
Yeah, the speed of the jury's decision, the fact that they awarded her $5 million is a huge victory, not just for Carol, but for the whole Me Too movement, for the whole women's movement. It's so rare for people to face consequences for sexual assault, especially things that happened in the past. Even the fact that this law was passed last year allowing survivors of sexual assault to come forward and file civil cases, this is not a usual thing to see, and it seems to be clearly the result of the Me Too movement. It followed right after a similar bill for child sex assault survivors, which several states have passed recently in the wake of revelations about the Catholic Church's sex abuse scandal and child sex abuse in athletics. But I think that the fact that this is happening at all, that's in a sexual assault that took place decades ago, can be taken seriously in the courts, and that a jury can find in favor of the victim is a remarkable thing. And the fact that it was a successful suit against one of the most powerful people in the world is really striking. A real victory for survivors of sexual assault, a real victory for the Me Too movement. And I think that one of the most striking things about the whole trial for me, and I think probably for a lot of people, was Trump's taped deposition that was played for the jury. If you haven't watched it, it's easy to find on YouTube. It was just incredible how little regard Trump had for the seriousness of the issues at stake at all. He was so lewd and arrogant for the entire deposition. I could see that the jury could have completely based their verdict just on a judgment of Trump's character and how he acted in this deposition.
I saw E. Jean Carroll and her lead attorney, Roberta Kaplan, on TV this morning. They were interviewed. And Roberta Kaplan said that the playing of that tape deposition from Trump, she thought was a major factor in the jury's verdict. You know, there were two major things there. One where he said stars being able to grab women by the pussy has been going on for a million years, fortunately or unfortunately. So she made something of that. And also he had claimed that, of course, he could not have, raped E. Jean Carroll because she wasn't his type. And then he mistook her for, in a picture, mistook her for one of his wives, and then claimed that the picture was blurry, but of course the picture was not blurry. So, typical Trump. But what E. Jean Carroll emphasized was that this verdict blew away the need to be a perfect victim to succeed in a prosecution or in sexual assault. She didn't scream, she didn't become a wallflower after the assault, and she didn't record it in her diary, and she didn't act like the perfect victim. Nonetheless, the jury believed her. They didn't believe anything coming down from Trump's lawyer, nor Trump, nor any of that.
Well, the other thing in the deposition is that he insulted the lawyer, saying she wasn't his type either in the deposition.
Yeah, I heard that. They're playing it every 15 minutes, yeah.
I mean, just absolutely incredible, the arrogance. You can't be taking the situation seriously if you're taking the time to insult the female lawyer and say she's not your type during a rape deposition over being accused of rape. I mean, just the arrogance is just jaw-dropping. How little he cares about this issue at all. It must have been so clear to the jury, like if they didn't already know how vapid and awful his character was. It was just written all over the deposition. It was so obvious.
Yeah, we know that it had to be obvious because they came in with a verdict in less than 3 hours. I mean, you got to put down your bag. Somebody's got to make coffee. Yeah. You have to appoint a 4-person jury. You got to fill out the forms. You got to put in number values for how much he owes. What's left is, how many of you think he did it? Everybody raised their hands. I mean, there's not time for much in less than 3 hours. So it was clear to them. What I found interesting, because I didn't know it till listening to Roberta Kaplan, the main lawyer for E. Jean Carroll, is that most of the members of the jury were not from New York City. Yeah, one was from Manhattan, one was from the Bronx, so those are New York City, and the other 7 jurors not from New York City. And the one from the Bronx is a right-wing conspiracy theorist type. So
yeah, so it wasn't all just liberal New York anti-Trumpers.
There were 10 specific counts total, and 9 of them went exactly for E. Jean Carroll. The one that came first that they said no on is that there was not proved to them a basis of a preponderance of evidence that he committed rape. And there's just been a lot of opinion mongering and speculation as to why that was. And I've heard everything from, well, they just compromised, to the word rape is too scary, to the fact that E. Jean Carroll was kind of unclear about that in her testimony. She had a lot of corroboration from people she spoke to about the attack at the time, and they didn't do anything specifically to corroborate rape. But the point is really that rape has a very specific legal meaning in New York, which is that as distinct from sexual abuse or sexual assault, which is what he was found liable of, to be rape, you actually have to have penetration. And so what the jury is saying is, we did not find, on the basis of preponderance of evidence, that we could conclude that that took place. Because all we have is E. Jean Carroll saying it, and she's a bit fuzzy on the specifics there. So I don't know why the jury came to that verdict, but it doesn't mean a hell of a lot, except as a PR thing where Trump can say, I wasn't found guilty of rape. But he's none too happy. The man's screaming on his fake Twitter, all caps. He's back to defaming her. He's back to saying this never happened. I don't know who this woman is, and he's there, they got this photograph of him from around that time where he's in the same photograph with her. I hope she sues him again for defamation.
Yeah, it's remarkable to see him making the same sorts of comments that he just lost the lawsuit over. He doesn't seem to have any ability to control his own behavior or to learn from mistakes because he's just not used to facing consequences. And now finally, one of his victims has gotten the better of him. And it feels like a real victory for victims of assault and for the women's movement, for the Me Too movement.
Well, on the Me Too, it's very interesting because Me Too is sometimes thought to have started with Harvey Weinstein. But as people were saying, that was really the culmination of a year of stuff beforehand, which was all Trump. Trump saying blood was coming out of her wherever, and he was insulting the women from the talent show, and I never said anything about anybody except for Rosie O'Donnell. And then, of course, the Access Hollywood tape, which was a main component of this trial that just took place. And what did that lead to? When the moment Trump wins the Electoral College, you got the resistance forming. You got the Women's March. 3-5 million people turn out. So there was already tremendous anger, tremendous fear, mobilization. And so Me Too is largely a product of Donald Trump having set it in motion. So this is, karma. This is what goes around, comes around.
I mean, one question is whether $5 million is going to be painful for Trump or he can fundraise so much off the back of all these things that it doesn't actually amount to anything. But I would suspect that all these legal fees and this $5 million settlement will be painful to him, but I don't really know.
Well, he has no businesses to speak of anymore except for fundraising and, selling merch. That's it. Nobody in the real estate world or anything else, licensing, they don't want to go near him. So that's one issue. But I tell you, the Republicans seem to me more between a rock and a hard place than ever, because even if the Trump base doesn't care and OANN and Newsmax and Fox, are downplaying it as they are, there are going to be enough people, I think, who are just like revolted and horrified and are going to say, no, I'm not doing it again. I'm not voting for Trump. I'm not going to vote at all. I'm going to vote for the other guy, whatever it might be. And you lose enough support, even if it's a little bit. There's a tipping point, and I think they've reached that tipping point between this and the fight back on abortion. I think it's going to be very, very hard for them. And you're already getting, Republican senators and stuff saying that the problem is they can't do anything. He's going to win the primary because the base is all in support of him. But I think they're going to have a tremendous amount of trouble in the general election.
Yeah, that is the main problem facing the Republican Party. It works in the primary. It doesn't work in the general election. So the only plan is to just undermine democracy.
Right. And there are cute operators like DeSantis and others that think that they can go hard right and be more MAGA than MAGA in the primary and then pivot. It's not working for DeSantis. It's not going to work. There is just such a stench now with Trump between the Alvin Bragg indictment, this jury decision where 9 regular people take less than 3 hours to say, yeah, he did it. He's lying. She's telling the truth. We're going to give her $5 million in the case where it's not even about the money. They didn't even ask for a specific amount of money. This is going to dog him. I can't see how he digs his way out of this. I mean, I've seen him dig his way out of a lot, and he's got the undying support of a fascist base. But when the whole party gets known as the rape Republican Party, they're in deep trouble.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we will revisit these topics a lot more in the future as more consequences may be on the horizon for Trump this year. But now we're going to get to our main event, our interview with Avishai Green about the protest movement against proposed judicial reforms in Israel. We are pleased to welcome back to the podcast Avishai Green. This is his second time on the podcast. Regular listeners will perhaps remember a conversation we probably had over a year ago with Avishai about an essay he wrote called Speaking Bullshit to Power. Avishai is a doctoral candidate in political science at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And since he has expertise in politics and lives in Jerusalem, we thought it would be good to have him on the podcast to talk about all the mass protests going on in Israel right now around these proposed judicial reforms. So Avishai, it was very nice to offer to come back on the podcast and help us understand some of the political dynamics going on in Israel right now.
Hey, hi, Brendan. Hi, Andrew. Great to be back.
I like to start with just a few basic questions to set the stage so that our listeners are up to speed, and then we can get into the heavier issues a bit later. What we're talking about is the new government's proposed judicial reform legislation, the massive and growing, never-ending protest against this, and where this is all headed. So what is the proposed judicial reform legislation about?
So the proposed judicial reform legislation is officially, if you ask them, it's about reforming the judiciary in a way that will increase the power of the people, by which they mean Parliament, the Knesset, and rein in the judiciary, which the line goes is overreaching. And the way that this is done is it's not one thing. It's actually a whole really long and extensive and very radical range of proposed reforms that, if implemented, would completely make the judiciary completely toothless. And that is why what it really is about is just consolidating power in a way that would basically make Israel not a democracy, and by any measure. And the reason I say that is because in the basic checks and balances of democracy, Israel is starting off is at quite a weak position. We don't really have any separation between the legislative and the executive. They're fused together. Basically, the government is formed outside of the parliament, and once you have a majority in one, you basically have it in the other. So there's no checks and balances there. We only have one parliament, unlike the US where you have House of Representatives and the Senate. We only have one. Maybe the main thing is we don't have a constitution. And so really basically the only check and balance that we have at the moment on the executive branch and the legislative branch together is the judicial branch, and proposed judicial reform would completely eliminate that, and it would actually do it several times over. It's extremely far-reaching, so it would pass a law that would allow the parliament, the Knesset, to override any decision by the Supreme Court. It would allow Parliament to, the coalition, to name its judges, which is different than the system we have now, which is a system where needs to be a consensus over naming judges. And it would allow political appointments, which is not the system we have at the moment. So it would really do a lot of things all together, all at once, that even any of them alone would really give whoever's in power pretty much unfettered power.
Netanyahu is all in favor of this judicial reform. What's in it for him?
He wants to stay out of jail, is what's in it for him. He's been on trial for 3 years now. He's been under indictment for, I believe, 4 years. And the whole Israeli political system has basically been bent to his will to stay out of jail the last few years. He's done a lot of things politically that are very much motivated by that. And this judicial reform is about that for him in two main ways. One is, if it passes, he'll be able to stay out of jail in a few different ways. First of all, as I mentioned, the government will have control over naming judges, which they don't at the moment. At least they don't on their own. But if it would pass, he could basically name whoever he wants. And it's a foregone conclusion that if he will be found guilty in this case, he will appeal it to the Supreme Court. And then in this scenario, it would be with judges that he's named. But there are other more creative ways that he could also do it. He could name his own attorney general, switch attorney generals, which is not something that is done at the moment, but he could do that and then have the attorney general withdraw the indictment. Or he could do even more creative things. Because basically the thing to understand is once this reform passes, there really is no limit on what the government can do. Because again, we don't have a constitution. So theoretically, they could, the day after it passes, pass a law that anyone named Benjamin can't go to jail. And really no one could do anything about it if they had 61 votes, which is the bare majority. I'm not saying they do that, but something that they have openly talked about doing is literally just canceling one of the main criminal offenses that he is accused of, which is breach of trust, I believe is the term. There already is a proposal to just cancel that as an offense. They say it's too vague. And once that would happen, he would automatically be no longer on the hook for that. So there's really a whole host of ways. And that's the direct way in which he's interested in this judicial reform. And the second has to do with his coalition, which is in order to go along with his personal desires and needs, he is beholden to the most far-right coalition this country has ever had, and he has partners who are interested in this reform for other reasons. And in that sense, this reform is sort of, it's a deal. It's a deal that's being done between him and other partners who are even more extreme in other ways and have their own reasons for wanting this reform. Yeah.
Right. We in the United States are kind of familiar with heads of the government trying to game the judiciary to stay out of prison and other things like that. But like you say, I mean, Netanyahu is trying to escape bribery conviction and jailing and stuff. But a lot of the right wing in Israel is also in favor of this proposed so-called judicial reform. And there were small protests and recently a large protest by the right wing in favor of the legislation. And these people have got their own motivations, presumably that are different from Netanyahu's. Why has this proposed legislation become popular within the right generally?
So I think there are three actors or groups that are worth highlighting and coming together and pushing this thing, or even four. One being, as I said, Netanyahu, and he does have a core of like diehard supporters. We call them Bibistim. They often call themselves that, people whose main really political identity is supporting him, much like Trump Republicans. So there definitely are people who want it because he wants it. But that being said, the more substantial actors are, so this proposal was written by a think tank that is funded by American libertarians here in Israel. It's called a Kohelet Forum. It's funded by the Tikva Fund. It's American Jews that are very much the right-wing part of the Republican Party, the libertarians, and they have a very far-right vision for Israel, which they've been working at for years, and they've been doing it very, very effectively. Behind the scenes, most people have never heard of them until a few months ago. They've been doing it in a lot of ways. And they literally wrote this plan, and they did it because they have, this vision for Israel that is, on the one hand, a libertarian vision of a state in which the government, or the administrative state, maybe I should say, has very little power, and there's very little regulation, unfettered free markets, and all of that. And on the other hand, it's also a very nationalist vision that they have about having a nationalist Jewish state that can do what it wants. So that's their motivation, and that leads into the next group, which is very substantial, which is the settlers, the settler bloc in Israeli society. They're interested in this plan because the Supreme Court has been historically one of the main impediments towards Israel annexing the West Bank and basically doing whatever it wants. It's been a check and balance, and by no means has it stopped the occupation, but it has restrained it in some senses. And they have a belief which is justified, coupled with a paranoia which is not exactly justified, that once the Supreme Court is out of the way, they'll be able to annex the West Bank, which is true, and they'll also be able to solve all their problems with the Palestinians, which is not true. It's a fantasy, but that's why they're interested in it, and that is actually a part of the population. Like the libertarians I was talking about, that doesn't really represent an electorate. It really is a small, motivated, influential group of people behind the scenes. But settlers, they're a minority of the population, but there definitely is a public there. And you mentioned demonstrations. I believe that there was a demonstration last week, which really was quite large. I believe it was, by and large, that's who came. It was the settler, the religious kind of extremist part of the population. And the last group are the Haredim.
Can you hold just a second?
Sorry. Yes.
You tied in word settler to occupation and the West Bank, and I'm not sure that everybody knows the connection between those three things.
Okay.
So if you could just explain that a little bit.
Okay, I'll try. Since 1967, the Six-Day War, Israel has military control of the West Bank, which is this large area on the eastern side of Israel, the West Bank of the Jordan River. It's between Israel and Jordan. And it's this large area that is not part of Israel, but we have military control of, and there is an ongoing project, a settlement project of Israeli motivated ideological nationalists that have been going and settling there for decades now in order to, as they say it, set facts on the ground and turn it into part of Israel. Their vision is having it be part of Israel. In fact, their vision is even more far-reaching than that. They talk about the biblical Israel, the greater Israel, which is a lot larger. It actually includes modern-day Jordan, and like that's really quite out there. That's a crazy vision. But what isn't fortunately crazy is the West Bank, because of all these settlements, it's only deepened the military occupation, because once you have a Jewish settlement there, then the military protects it. And it's this ongoing process by which this dedicated ideological group, which is a minority in Israeli society, but has really for decades now they've been very successful in deepening the military occupation of the West Bank. And their at least immediate goal is having Israel annex those parts and having them become part of the country, very much ignoring the question of what will happen with the majority of people who live there, who are Palestinians, of course, and are not citizens of Israel. And I don't think they're planning to make them citizens once we annex them. That's not the idea. The idea is that they would, I guess, be non-citizens, and then that really is kind of, for liberal Israelis like me, that's kind of the nightmare scenario, because then we really would be basically officially an apartheid state with a large population that has no rights, whereas now they're not part of the country, and we can at least hope, people like myself do, that one day they'll have their own country that we can have peace with. So those are sort of the competing visions. And the settlers, as I said, have been very successful, and they see overturning the power of the judiciary to block whatever they want to do in the West Bank as an important part of their plan. Part of it is less rational as well. I think there's a feeling among the segment of the population of anger and alienation at what they see as sort of liberal institutions of Israel. Almost 20 years ago, 18 years ago, Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip, which is on the other side, and it's another area that we conquered in 1967. And when we pulled out of there, we evacuated several thousand settlers that were there from their homes. And that very much is still a trauma for this segment of the population. And you hear all the time now when they're talking about the judicial reform, and people say to them, this is such a dangerous plan, it will harm minorities. And a refrain that you hear again and again is, oh, where were you guys in the disengagement? Where were you guys in 2005? Their claim being, the Supreme Court, you say the Supreme Court protects minorities. It didn't protect us from being evacuated back then. So now basically it's time for revenge. And in that sense, it's also very emotional and tribal, and not only a rational plan. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry for the interruption, but I thought it was helpful. So
No,
you're
for sure.
basically talking about pillars of support for the so-called judicial reform on the right, and you said there are the diehard supporters of Netanyahu, and
Right.
they want it because they want to help him. You said that there's this libertarian think tank funded by U.S. money, and they really designed the whole project. And then you talked about the settlers movement, and there's a fourth one.
Right. The fourth one are the Charedim, as we call them, who are the ultra-Orthodox Jews. And they're a very sort of secluded group in Israeli society by choice. They're very insular, and they live quite separately in many ways from the rest of society. And they have their own interests and their own political interests. And the pressing thing for them is they basically don't go to the military. We have a mandatory military draft for Jews in this country, but they've been more or less exempt of it for decades, but not in an official way exactly. It's sort of the result of all kinds of temporary agreements that were made, and they want to make this permanent, and they want to make it official and allowed. It's kind of a complicated issue, but just I'll say one sentence, the status quo at the moment is the way that they get out of the military is if they are in a yeshiva and study Torah, study the Bible. So that's what they do. And some of them do that because that's what they want to do. But in fact, many of them, because that's the status quo, basically have to be in yeshiva, even if they're not suited for it, in order to not go to the military, which they don't want to go to because they are very afraid of assimilating and what will happen to them there with the rest of society. So basically what they want is to pass
and the women get
Yes.
out because of issues of so-called modesty, right?
Correct. Religious women have an easy time getting out, even not ultra-Orthodox religious women. If they don't want to go, they can get out because of that. But the men are very afraid I should say the rabbis are very afraid of having the men go and being in mixed units with the rest of Israeli society, specifically being with women, which is a big, big issue. For all of these reasons, they want to pass a law that basically says they just don't have to go, and they don't have to go and pretend that they're studying Torah or anything. They just don't have to go, period. And they think that if they would pass such a law now, it would be overturned by the Supreme Court, because it has happened before. Something similar has happened before. The Supreme Court overturned an earlier attempt of theirs to do something similar years ago. And for that reason, their political representation is pretty laser focused on passing the override clause, which I mentioned earlier, so that they will be able to pass this law. And then if the Supreme Court cancels the law, overturns the law, they'll be able to immediately, with a simple majority, I don't know if I stressed this before, but the override clause that's being talked about is a simple majority override. You don't need 2/3 or anything like that. Any majority, is a 51% majority, would be able to overturn any attempts by the Supreme Court to rein in such decisions. So that's their interest. All the things I'm saying are the immediate talked about interests, the ones that are very clear, like the ones that are in their coalition agreements that they've talked about passing in the first year and so on. But I do think the main thing to stress is that if they will pass this judicial reform, then there really is no limit to what they can do afterwards. So, the settlers want to annex the West Bank. They're pretty clear about that. They're not ashamed of that. But there are a lot of, as I mentioned, this is the most far right and the most religious coalition we've ever had, and there are voices in it that are extremely homophobic. For example, like not just in a passive way, but there's a small party, but a party that is part of the coalition, and one of them, in fact, was made a minister, that's explicitly homophobic. That's basically all that it's about. And they have things they want to pass. There's a lot of very, let's say, not feminist parts of the coalition that have all kinds of things that they're interested in doing. And the ultra-Orthodox, who I just mentioned, the army is the thing that right now they're very focused on, but they have many, many aspirations for how this country should look that are, much more closer, that are not a democracy, or much closer to a theocracy than a democracy. The libertarians, of course, have a lot of things they want to do. The point I'm trying to make is that once this passes, there really won't be any limit to what they will be able to do.
We've seen a lot of pictures and headlines about pretty large and sustained and growing public protests against these judicial reforms. And probably most listeners can intuit what those concerns are that people have based on your description of the reforms. But apparently also there's polling that a lot of people in Israel do want some kind of judicial reform, but not these particular reforms. So if it's true that there's a lot of support for judicial reform, what's that about? And then, what are the main reasons behind the opposition to this current proposals for reform?
Yeah, there are polls that show that a lot of Israelis support some kind of judicial reform. I think it's the result of two things. One is that there definitely are, real problems in the judicial system, but like any other system. But there are problems in Israel. There's a central issue which has to do with the backlog in the system. Trials here can take years. In fact, even trials, like really important ones, like the Prime Minister's trial, Netanyahu has been on trial for 3 years, and there's really is no end in sight. It's going to go for at least another year. So that's something that obviously a lot of people are angry at, and there are other issues, but it's very important to note that the reform has nothing to do with this. It does not address this in any way. But the other part is that there has been a successful right-wing, years-long propaganda campaign against the judiciary, which I think has worked on two levels. I think it's convinced people who are right-wing, it's convinced them the judiciary is, using terms that you may be familiar with in the US, is part of the deep state, the liberal deep state, that its members are all left-wing, they're all liberal, and governments, especially right-wing governments, it's been a very useful punching bag for them to, anytime they don't succeed at anything, to point at the Supreme Court and say, well, they stopped us, or we couldn't do this because we knew they would overturn it. Just this week, I heard a member of parliament being interviewed and asked, what do you guys have to show? You've been in power for a few months now, and you really haven't advanced in any of the things you promised. And he literally just said, yes, but we're not in power. The Supreme Court is the one who's in power, so it's their fault. So in that sense, it's very useful, and there have been a lot of people that have been convinced that there is some problem and some reform is needed, even if when you actually ask people what it is, it doesn't have much to do with what's being proposed, except if you're very, very ideologically, you have been convinced that, basically the judiciary is a left-wing cabal, and there just needs to be majoritarian rule, and that's it, which is basically the philosophy behind it. So the other thing you asked me is why there's opposition to it. So yeah, as you gestured, I think you can intuit why there is opposition to it. But I think what I'll say is that I think that the coalition and Netanyahu made a very fundamental strategic mistake. We had political gridlock here for 4 years. This was the 5th election after we had 4 elections that were basically deadlocked, and almost nobody won. And suddenly this election, there was a clear victory. There were 64 seats for the coalition versus 56, not actually representing a large majority of the people because of reasons that have to do with kind of wasted votes, parties that didn't pass the minimum threshold. The actual vote distribution didn't change from the past 4 years, in which basically the country is 50-50. But anyway, for political reasons, there was this decisive victory, and I think that it kind of got to their head, and they went with this very expansive, very radical reform all at once, and at the same time were very open about the other things that they want to do and are going to do once this reform is passed. So all of the misogynistic, homophobic, racist, openly racist parts of the government have been very kind of open about, it's our turn and we're gonna rule now and you can't stop us. Every other day there's like a law proposal that one of them offers that are really, every one of them is more extreme than the other. And all of this goes to say that I think they moved so quickly and so strongly, and they didn't anticipate what the public reaction to that would be, which is very, very widespread anger. And I would say, people are very, very afraid. If they would have moved maybe in a slower way, I don't think most people would have noticed if they would just, changed the composition of the committee that names the judges. Like, most people don't really know much about that. But when they're doing everything all at once, it's managed to scare the LGBTQ community, it's managed to scare women, it's managed to anger the large sector of the population, which is military reservists who, see the long-standing contract, as it were, between them and the country sort of being trampled, with the ultra-Orthodox just seeking to formalize their exemptions. It's very much angered and frightened, perhaps more, the very influential high-tech sector in Israel, which has been saying for months, once you pass this, we're no longer going to be a democracy, and we're no longer going to be a country where foreign countries and foreign people want to invest. Our sector is entirely dependent on that, and it's just going to kill the high-tech sector, which is very influential. And all of these disparate, and I should say traditionally, many of them rather apolitical sectors of the population have really come out in force against this. And it's been, I believe, the largest and most extensive and sustained protests that I think this country has ever seen. It's been 17 weeks now when every Saturday night there have been huge protests all across the country, with the largest one in Tel Aviv always having hundreds of thousands of people in a country that only has 9 million people. I don't know, if you do the math, that would be like every week having demonstrations in the U.S. totaling, many dozens of millions of people.
I did the math.
Oh, okay.
Basically, more than 5% of the entire country's population came out to the biggest demonstration. And you'd be talking about 17, 18 million people in the United States. That would be the equivalent.
And I saw another statistic that closer to 20% had participated at some point in the last few months. So that's more like 60 million Americans demonstrating, at least once over a few month period. That's only the highlight, but there have been much more sustained protests almost once a week during the week for several weeks in a row. There's been days of disruption, they've been titled, in which protesters have done things that have been purposefully disruptive, such as blocking main highways and demonstrating. During the day, there have been many thousands of small, spontaneous or semi-spontaneous protests that have targeted the coalition members wherever they go, whether it's they're speaking at some event and protesters get up and disrupt their speech, or even if they're just going to a restaurant and people show up and yell at them. Even more probably influential than that has been military reservists who actually so far haven't actually done anything, but have made very clear threats of, if this passes, we're not going to show up anymore. And that has really kind of shaken up the whole system, because the military here is very dependent on the reserve forces, especially the elite units, especially the Air Force is dependent on pilots who are no longer in active duty and just show up of their own accord, regularly. And these elite units especially have kind of been leading the charge of people saying, we have a contract with the country where we defend it, but we signed up to defend democracy, and if you pass this, we're not going to show up. That definitely is something that the coalition was not expecting, because it's really has been sort of a third rail of Israeli politics. It's no one has really gone there before, at least not in a successful, large-scale way. It's kind of been taboo as well, and it was done in a way that was substantial enough that I think really, really got the government concerned. That and the financial issues, which is also high-tech companies that have, very publicly, some of them, been joining the protests and been saying, we're leaving the country, we're taking our money out of it. All of that together has formed a really very substantial protest movement that they were not expecting.
Even in the United States, you read about Israelis who say they've always been right-wing, but they can't support the proposed legislation, and they've joined the protests. I'd like to know how common that is. Also, within Israel, what about the 2 million Arabs, Palestinians, and others who are citizens? They're not in the occupied territories. They're in the pre-67 borders. They're citizens of Israel, about 20% of the population. To what degree is there support for, opposition to the judicial reform within the Israeli Arab population? To what degree have they participated in the protests?
So I'll start with how right-wing voters see it. So I spoke earlier about these different groups that are behind the reform, which are the settlers and the ultra-Orthodox and these libertarians and kind of the diehard Netanyahu supporters. But the one large and most substantial group that I didn't mention is really just the larger group of Likud supporters, of people who voted for the Netanyahu's party, which is the largest party and has traditionally always been the largest right-wing party. And among that group, I would say it's not so much that people necessarily oppose the reform on the merits, as much as it's not something that interests this large group. This morning, actually, I saw a statistic which I thought was very telling, which was, if you ask people not if they support it or not, but whether they think the reform is important to them, if it's part of their priorities. So 70% of Likud primary voters say it's very important to them. So that's kind of the base of the party, and they care because it's become part of the party's political identity, at least these past few months. But only 30% of party voters, who are a much larger group of people, say that they care about it. Like, these are people who, despite everything I've said so far about why the coalition is interested in it, and despite the fact that it is true that for years they've been demonizing the judiciary, this has not been a core part of the right-wing agenda for years, which has traditionally been about our relationship with the Palestinians and the settlements and maybe financial issues. And really, this kind of came out of nowhere. So all I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of party voters who sort of don't understand what this is about, and maybe were willing to support it, or at least, let's say, haven't gone out and protested against it. But once they see the price that this has been taking from the country at large, I mentioned all of these large opposition steps, which really have taken a toll on the economy and on the military, on the security establishment. And there are a lot of people who say, this isn't worth it. We're not into it. Stop it and go do something else. And the way we know that is from just, general polling, which shows that if after we've had this deadlock for years in which basically, I don't even want to say right-wing and left-wing because it's more complicated than that, but really the main dividing line in Israeli politics is if you support Netanyahu or if you're against him. And after years where we've had almost 50-50, and this last election, a small majority for the pro-Netanyahu side, the last month or so, polls have shown that the current opposition, parties that make up the current opposition, would grow from 46% to 58%, to suddenly actually a quite pronounced majority, which they haven't been at in many years. So in fact, this reform and everything that's come about because of that, this reform has really eroded the base of support for this government, for this coalition, for Netanyahu. And there are a lot of people who don't see what it's good for. And there are a lot of other people, I can't give you numbers here, who also actually actively oppose it, that say, I am right wing, or I'm not crazy about the judiciary or something like that. But actually, this reform really takes it way too far, and it doesn't, just do one or two small tweaks. It really will stop Israel from being a democracy. So those are voices you hear. About the Arab Israelis, who, as you mentioned, are a large minority. They're 20% of the country. I don't have official statistics, but my very strong impression from following it has been that while, if you ask me, Israeli Arabs would be one of the first groups that will be harmed if this reform passes, because, as I've been explaining, the coalition doesn't want to, weaken entirely, basically neuter the judiciary for no reason. They want to do it so that then they'll be able to carry out their nationalist agenda in ways that are sure to harm the Arab minority and make their position even worse than it already is. However, sadly, I think the main feeling that Israeli Arabs have is alienation from the entire issue and the entire system, perhaps. And a quote you do hear a lot of them when they're interviewed is like, this is just an argument between Jews. And there's a lot of cynicism or apathy, and they definitely haven't taken a large part of the protests. And that's also definitely partially the fault, if you want to call it that, of the protest movement itself, which is, in the mainstream part of it at least, very national and patriotic and even militaristic. And the main thing that you see in the protests, really the overwhelming thing you see, is almost every person is carrying an Israeli flag. There are many, many thousands of Israeli flags, and a lot of the speakers are from the security establishment, and very much those are the terms they talk about, which I touched on a little bit earlier, of people who are saying, I was in the military for such and such years, I fought for this country, and now I'm fighting to keep it a democracy, which is messages that have a lot of resonance within Jewish Israeli society. But it's kind of, I hope it's clear to you, and I can explain if it isn't, why Israeli Arabs would feel put off by it and alienated by it.
Hey, we're going to return to this conversation in just a moment, but first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take just a few minutes to hear from Anja Clark, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors this podcast.
Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and today's many other social, political, and economic crises make this a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. In the U.S., we are faced with the threat of Trumpism triumphing and all-out authoritarianism extinguishing our right to carry on these discussions. Yet at the same moment, the multiracial movement for Black lives has spread to every corner of the country and the world, launching a flood of activism and new ideas that deepen the concept of freedom. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses, in which we do not merely assert but demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value, close quote. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not to socialism. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses who will form their own organization and whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Our ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, women, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. To this end, we open our website to the widest possible dialogue with people around the world. We intend to practice as well as espouse a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice, and as the way to assure the survival of Marxist humanism. Please join us.
So the protesters are concerned about the erosion of the democratic character of Israel, right? That Israel as a democracy is at risk. But of course, to a lot of observers, the democratic nature of Israel is partial anyway for Israeli Arabs who face a lot of racism and discrimination, for Palestinians in territories that are occupied by Israel. They're living under military rule. So is there any way that this protest movement is recognizing the link between those sort of injustices, that those anti-democratic natures of the Israeli state, and this new assault on democracy in Israel?
That's a good question. So the short answer is that the mainstream part of the protest movement, I would say, isn't dealing with that issue. But a smaller part of the protest movement definitely is. The mainstream part of the protest movement is very patriotic and kind of united against this liberal democratic message of let's preserve our democracy, and is very concerned with talking about things that most Israeli, at least most liberal Israelis, can get behind, which are representative democracy, which are women's rights, which are LGBTQ rights, which have quite wide support in this part of the population, and unfortunately, which are not opposition to the occupation, which is a much more divisive concept in Israeli politics. I'll give you an example of how this plays out. In one of the disrupting protests, which I was taking part in which we were blocking the main highway of Tel Aviv, I was actually interviewed on live radio by a journalist. And they asked me, one of the questions they asked me was, they said, the protest movement seems to be splintering a little bit in that it seems to have more demands than just stopping the reform. There's also now demands that have to do with church and state and pushing back against the ultra-Orthodox sector of the population's demands. And, what do you think of that? And my answer was, I said, I think that's fine. I think it's fine that as long as the protest movement is united against the central cause, which is stopping the coup, which is what we call it, it's absolutely acceptable that there'll be other demands as well from smaller groups of some people come out and protest because of church and state, and some people come out and protest against the occupation as well. And I literally just said that word, and the interviewer jumped in and said, whoa, that word you just used, aren't you afraid of alienating people by using that word, the occupation? I literally hadn't even said anything about the occupation myself. All I had said was that there are some people that's their motivation. And that was enough to sort of get this very sort of paranoid response of, are you sure you want to talk about it? So that's how a lot of people see it, unfortunately. That being so, there is all of the large protests, especially the one in Tel Aviv, has alongside the main protest, there's a smaller anti-occupation bloc of more, you could say, far left, I guess, movements that are very explicitly saying, we, unlike maybe other people that are protesting here, we're not protesting in order to preserve the status quo, at least not only. Yes, we are against this reform because it's a coup and it'll make things a lot worse, but that's not enough. We are protesting to make Israel more democratic, and there are probably different interpretations about what that means. I do want to mention a activist group that I'm a small part of. I participate in, sometimes called Standing Together, which is a Arab-Jewish joint socialist activist group that's active in all kinds of political struggles for years. And that's very much been their line throughout these protests. Yes, we're going to show up. Yes, we are going to make our voice heard against this nationalist, extremist, right-wing government, but we're not just protesting in order to maintain the judiciary's power. We're also protesting against the occupation. We're also protesting against the racism, which in a somewhat ironic way has always been there, I guess, but this current government has really made it more apparent than ever. And in that way, by making things worse, at least they've sort of taken the masks off. I think they have radicalized some people. One event I would note that happened 2 months ago, well, there was a Palestinian terrorist attack which killed, I believe, 2 Israelis, which was terrible. But then in retaliation, there was a large-scale, basically a pogrom or a lynch that evening of settlers that went to the Palestinian town where this happened and really ran amok there and burned places down and killed a person. This hadn't really happened before to such a wide extent of hundreds of people participating. And what was even more shocking was that because our current government literally has, maybe I didn't stress this enough earlier, but it literally has in it Jewish terrorists, I guess. It's the equivalent of having Richard Spencer in Congress. So we have that here, unfortunately. And some of the members of the coalition, wouldn't condemn this terrible event, and some of them even went as far as outright supporting it. And I think that really did radicalize a lot of people to see, yes, it's always been bad, but it's going to get much worse if this government has its way. They're going to carry out even worse things. And ever since then, a recurring thing that happens at demonstrations is whenever police use force against protesters, which I wouldn't say happens that often or in such an extreme way, but definitely has happened sometimes, a almost immediate refrain that sort of caught on that protesters yell at them, at the police, is, "Where were you in Hawara?" And Hawara is the name of the Palestinian town where this happened, as in, you were coming and using force against us pro-democracy protesters. Where were you when you really were needed, when extremists, basically Jewish terrorists, went out and did this thing and you basically stood by and waited? And in that sense, I do think that despite everything I said earlier about the protest movement being kind of very afraid of taking on the occupation, I do think that the extreme nature of this government has radicalized at least some people, and seeing how these issues are all connected, and you can't really make this kind of artificial distinction between the government's desire to overthrow democracy and the government's desire to annex the territories and turn us into an apartheid state. Yeah, that it's not the mainstream, but it is also part of the voices you hear. And these protests, despite what I said earlier about the majority of Israel's 20% of Arabs, who I don't think have been participating, certainly that hasn't been large demonstrations, these are joint Jewish and Arab protests, smaller ones that have been taking place.
But how do you see this standoff? Is it the kind of thing where it doesn't matter how much people protest, they're just going to ram this thing through? Is there real potential here to take judicial reform off the table? Was this going to tear apart Israeli society? How do people see this playing forward?
That's kind of the million-dollar question. I don't know is the short answer. If you would have asked me a little more than a month ago, I would have said this is heading towards a collision course. The government is completely not showing any signs of backing off, but the protest movement is likewise extremely committed, and this is kind of going to come to a head. And the sense that already kind of happened, it happened over a little more than a month ago, I should say, the government has been passing the reform. They announced it literally 5 days after the government was sworn in, and they started doing it immediately. And to pass a law, it's a process. It takes a while. You have to do it several times, several votes. But they were already quite far along. Most of the laws that are part of this reform had already been halfway through or 2/3 of the way through. And as they were progressing, the protest movement was getting, stronger. And not only were these Saturday night protests growing, but the rest of the more disruptive actions were also increasing. And sort of the climax of this was at the end of March, when following the increasing call of military reservists saying they weren't going to show up, the defense minister, who's part of the government and part of the coalition and part of the ruling party, came out against Netanyahu and against the rest of his party and said, as defense minister, I'm saying we have to stop this now because actually it's making the military weak in a way that is dangerous. And when this was a big deal, but then Netanyahu immediately announced he was firing the defense minister for speaking out, even though he had, couched his position not in ideological terms or anything like that, but in concern for the security of Israel. The night that happened, he announced it, I believe, at 9 p.m., and this was March 26th on just a weekday. And an hour later, perhaps even less, there were, I think, hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets. It wasn't an organized protest. There were no speakers. There was no stage, but it really was very spontaneous and overwhelming. And people in Tel Aviv, where I was, people, just dozens and dozens of thousands of people streamed into the main highway, which was blocked off, and also were lighting bonfires. And it was really a feeling that something fundamental had broken, and people were reacting very, very emotionally. The whiplash was so immediate and extreme that the government backed off. Partially, though. They didn't say it's off the table. They said, in order to keep Israeli society from tearing apart, which is what seems to be happening, we're tabling this for now, and we're calling for talks so that we will pass this in agreement, which up until then they'd shown no sign of doing, and we're just talking about ramming it through with whatever majority they have. So that was a little over a month ago, and since then there have been these talks between the coalition and the opposition, with the purported goal of coming to some agreed reform that they can all support. I don't think that's going to happen. I think most people anticipate that it's going to fail, these talks. And then the question is what will happen? And I think it's unclear, actually, because I think that Netanyahu, he has dueling instincts. I think he was kind of burned by this earlier attempt, which ultimately failed. And I do think that one possibility is, he's never going to come out and say, I was wrong and I'll stop. But he's very good at sort of putting things off and presenting himself as a winner, even as he's losing. So one possibility is that he just keeps putting this off and does other things. But another probably more likely possibility is his coalition members won't let him, and they will still try to push through even a partial part of this reform, maybe not the whole thing, but they definitely, the one thing they don't seem to want to give up is appointing their own judges, which I know in the US that basically is the system, but it's not the system we have, and it is a very large change. And I think the protest movement is so united and so motivated that I think even a partial move like that would still bring people out on the streets in force. I should say people are still out on the street every Saturday night, but even more than that. And then I don't know what will happen. I think it's headed towards some kind of clash. One possibility is that the government falls apart over this if one part of the coalition decides it isn't into it anymore and another part pulls the other way. Personally, I hope that would happen and that we don't have to go through 4 years of this coalition. But another possibility is definitely what they're hoping realistically is just to wait a little bit, to have people forget about it or relax and go home and then pass the reform or pass parts of the reform. I don't think that'll happen, though. I think people are committed, but that's what they're trying, I believe.
Well, it's about time for us to wrap up this conversation. Thank you, Avishai, so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
You're welcome. Good to talk to you guys.
Hey, that's all the time we have for this episode of Radio Free Humanity. If you like the podcast, please do stop by Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org to listen to other episodes and to read more about these issues and others. As always, if you like the podcast, we encourage you to write to us, to comment and rate the podcast, and of course to share with all your friends and enemies.